we're going to talk about it right now in Instant Audit with Jim Frischling, who's our guest from NewOak Capital, where he's president and co-founder. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning.
Braving the puddles out here, the New York City sidewalks to get in this morning. No, we're expecting a lot of snow later. The U.S. banks may not be as exposed to Greece, as Jenna points out, maybe more exposure in places like Spain and Ireland, but apparently the German banks are, and the French banks. So I guess Germany comes to the rescue here. Is that still the hope? I mean, and does that make sense to you?
I think that's the hope. I also think that's the expectation. The choice is really between two evils. You have to choose between essentially bailing out of a country that maybe had looser fiscal policies than others and probably spent too much, or you let a member of the euro fail. And I think the choice is, and we've seen this in our own backyard, when the choice is failure, it seems that governments will come to the rescue, and that's what Germany, I think, is about to lead on behalf of the European Union.
Well, let's talk about the euro a little bit. What do you think this scenario, and we're watching the players move into position. We don't know anything yet, but what do you think this says about the scenario and the viability of this type of currency, the long-term viability of the euro actually being good for the region?
It's a great question. I mean, I think this is the first, at least in the last, since the euro's, I guess, introduction. This is, I think, the biggest test it's going to face in terms of a potential sovereign default of one of its members.
I mean, there were people when the euro was first introduced that said it wouldn't survive. The European region would not survive its first major recession. Will it?
I think it's going to survive, but I'll tell you this, there's going to be a backlash, and there's going to be, as we've seen, again, in our own situation, a lot of unintended consequences. And there are going to be those who have taken risk, who are now going to, the losses are going to be socialized.
They'll affect us, those consequences?
Well, to a certain extent, I think you made the point that the U.S. banks are not as exposed to a Greece or Spain and Portugal as some of the European banks, but there is exposure, and I guess I could make the argument that the banks that took that risk, to a certain extent, aren't going to actually be held accountable, or rather experience the losses if the bailout does come through, which is, again, what we expect. So I think you have an issue in Europe where there'll be lots of people who are having their own hard time and feel the losses are being socialized, whereas the gains had been, to a certain extent, privatized. And now they're going to come to the aid of Greece and expect something possibly similar for Spain and for Portugal. But again, this money won't come free. It won't be, even though that cheap, I think, but it's still going to come.
A lot of strings attached. All right, Jim. So it was nice to look at those pictures of Greece, if nothing else.
It was kind of, give us something to think about.
The weather we have here.
Nice
we'll talk to you a little bit later on in the hour, Jim.
When are we going to do this story on location?
Absolutely, the three of us. Ashley, are you up for it?
We're going to bring back in Jim Frischling. He's the president and co-founder of NewOak Capital. And one of these reports, Jim, was also mentioning expectations of whether or not any sort of deal that we get from the EU, from Germany specifically, will meet market expectations. What do you think the market is expecting specifically?
I do think the market is now starting to price in. There will be some sort of deal, and I think the expectations will be EU-led. The next iteration would be IMF-led, but I think the EU wants to.
Do you think it's looking for a dollar amount, a specific line of support?
I don't want to speculate on the details. I will tell you that the feeling is that the number and the amount is manageable. In fact, it is not something that would be, let's say, would be difficult. I think the challenge is the message that it would send, and I think to that extent, the news coming out of France right now is just that. There's a balancing act. They're not going to make this easy. They're not going to say it's a clear-cut decision because, look, we're having our own financial issues here in the States. Europe is having its issues, and they're not going to just quickly come to the aid of a country with no strings attached and not a cost.
Because you do create the issue of a moral hazard again.
Absolutely.
I mean, this time for sovereign nations that are anticipating and expecting and counting on a bailout from other countries. So if you bail out Greece here, as the reports have suggested might happen, what do you do if it's Spain, which is a much larger economy? Not to say that we don't know what's going to happen next in Europe. I mean, how they handle this is very delicate.
I find the issue they're facing eerily similar to something to what we just did.
Yeah.
And again, if you actually look at what got done, a far greater crisis in the U.S. was deemed to be averted, but it did come with a lot of frustrations and a lot of unintended costs. And I think right now we're seeing that on, I don't want to say a larger scale, but now on a sovereign scale. And this does affect the banking sector because clearly banks have great risk, not just to Greece, but as you mentioned, Spain and to a smaller extent, I guess, Portugal.
How long does the market give the EU before we get the specifics?
I think we're going to have some swings, but obviously there's a meeting in Brussels tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow.
And then I think there'll be some back and forth. I think there'll probably be an indicative answer within the matter of days. I'll speculate before the week is out. Before the full week is out, includes working through the weekend.
Yeah.
But I do expect there'll be some clarity on this. The details will start to leak out, and you will have a lot of opposition.
I think you're right, though. It is like a flashback, because you just used before the weekend. I mean, it's like going back to last year here, where every Sunday night we were waiting to see what type of an announcement was made, what type of change, bailouts, and all that type of thing. So you buy into this. Greece is kind of the Lehman Brothers of Europe, so to speak. In some ways.
To a certain extent, I do, and as you just pointed out, and there's Spain and Portugal behind it.
Right, and Spain and Portugal behind it. Well, all right. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate that very much. Now we're going to talk about the weather. All right, let's talk about that with Jim Frischling of NewOak Capital. Jenna hit on it. One of the interesting points, not only about Disney, but other media companies, including our parent, News Corp and Time Warner, is that the cable TV networks have been doing better, ESPN and Disney Channel in Disney's case. Is that a sign that things are turning around?
I think there's some encouraging news in Disney's earning. And again, I think they're really a very interesting company from the consumer standpoint, from the advertiser, from the content that they have, from the distribution channels, the theme parks, et cetera. But I will still say that one of my takeaways from it was the consumer still seems a little lackluster. Theme park, exactly.
Or maybe they just don't like Mickey Mouse.
I think Ricky's in great shape. I think concerns over travel, both from a safety standpoint as well as a hassle. So I do think there's a lackluster consumer, and the advertisers are showing that as well. So again, the numbers weren't bad. In fact, slightly better than expected. But I still think people expected. I still think people wanted to see better numbers and be surprised to the upside.
You know, we were talking to Matt McCall of Penn Financial yesterday about Disney and what's to come, and asked him of whether or not the staycations were still around, and if Disney would benefit with all its merchandising, with its TV play as well. John Friedman from MarketWatch was also on last week talking about the media side of this and what the consumer is doing staying at home. Is this a sign, though, that media is back?
Right.
Well, I do think yes, media I think is back, and I also feel that Disney will benefit because of those different distribution channels. They can actually satisfy and deliver product to people who are on staycations.
Well, we need to know if media is back, because it affects us. We don't care about this theme park. We want to know, is media back? This is how we make money. Is media back?
I certainly.
Come on, is it back?
It's back.
Advertisers are back or no?
Advertisers, unfortunately, discounting is still the new black in terms of getting things done. But I will say I'm optimistic about 2010.
But does that mean you'd actually play in the sector right now? I mean, when we say something's back, does that mean it's a buying opportunity?
I think I love that the Super Bowl was the most watched event of all time in the U.S., eclipsing MASH. The first time they're now in the #1 spot. So I think that's a good sign for me.
As Jim said, media is back. It's uphill from here. Thank you, Jim.
You're
we'll
very
talk to you on
welcome.
our web show in the next hour. That's the future of media and the internet, as you know.